Good evening, constant reader. Tonight, I will be reading and reacting to a Stephen King story that I have never read before, as we play our favorite game, Stephen Kingo. It's a lot like bingo, except instead of marking numbers, we mark these little squares as we read the story and discover some of Stephen King's familiar tropes and writing techniques within the fiction. And if we get 5 in a row, we win. We've never won before, but who knows, maybe this time we will. If you'd like to play along with your own randomly generated Kingo card for free, there is a link in the description. Tonight's story is The Turbulence Expert. Featured in Stephen King's latest collection of short fiction, You Like It Darker. Keep in mind that this is a reaction and commentary video with starts and stops as we check off the Kingo card, and I seriously haven't read this story before, so I might laugh, cry, or quite possibly scream like a little girl. Bear that in mind if you haven't read this story before. And remember, for an uninterrupted listening experience, the audiobook version features Will Patton, a much more professional voice than your humble narrator here. So, if you are ready to fly along with us as we hold on to our Kingo card, welcome to the Stephen King Book Club and get ready to experience The Turbulence Expert. Before we begin, my guess from the story's title is that this will be a tale of terror that takes place on a jumbo jet. And I'm guessing this story will be especially intense for anyone with a phobia related to airplane travel. Do you have a fear of flying? Or have you had a harrowing experience high in the sky? Let us know in the comments. And now that we're all clear for takeoff, let's begin. The Turbulence Expert by Stephen King. 1. Craig Dixon was sitting in the living room of a Four Seasons Junior suite, eating expensive room service chow and watching a movie on pay-per-view when the phone rang. His previously calm heartbeat lost its mojo and sped up. Dixon was unattached, the perfect definition of a rolling stone, and only one person knew he was here in this fancy hotel across from Boston Common. He considered not answering, but the man he thought of as the facilitator would only call back and keep calling until he answered. If he refused to answer, there would be consequences. This isn't hell, he thought. The accommodations are too nice, but it's purgatory, and no prospect of retirement for a long time. He muted the TV and picked up the phone. He didn't say hello. What he said was, "This isn't fair. I just got in from Seattle 2 days ago. I'm still in recovery mode." "Understood, and terribly sorry, but this has come up, and you're the only one available." "Sorry" came out thorry. The facilitator had the soothing, put-you-to-sleep voice of an FM disc jockey, spoiled only by an occasional light lisp. That sound you just heard isn't part of the story, and it isn't a buckle your seatbelt sound. That sound indicates that we have paused the story for just a little bit for some of our Kingo commentary. All right, that is almost page 1 of The Turbulence Expert, and we can already fill in a Kingo square. Here it says characters with a repeating catchphrase or verbal tick, and we will count the lisp as a verbal tick. On my card, by the way, smack dab in the middle is Maine, which in a lot of stories would be a given, a free space. But right now, this story sounds like it takes place in Boston Commons, so I might not be checking that middle square. I hope you fare better than I do. By the way, the turbulence expert was originally part of a 2018 collection of horror stories called Flight or Fright. It's an anthology that features a lot of classic tales, including Richard Matheson's 1960s masterpiece, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which, as you probably know, was adapted into a quintessential Twilight Zone episode. So that is one story that might be hard for even Stephen King to top. Let's see. Dixon had never seen him, but imagined him as tall and slim, with blue eyes and an ageless, unlined face. In reality, he was probably fat, bald, and swarthy, but Dixon felt confident his mental picture would never change, because he never expected to see the facilitator. He had known a number of turbulence experts over his years with the firm. It was a firm, and none of them had ever seen the man. Certainly none of the experts who worked for him were unlined. Even the ones in their 20s and 30s looked middle-aged. It wasn't the job, where there were sometimes late hours but no heavy lifting. It was what made them capable of doing the job. "Tell me," Dixon said. "Allied Airlines, Flight 19, non-stop, Boston to Sarasota. Leave at 8:10 tonight. You've just got time to make it." "There's nobody else?" Dixon realized he was nearly bleeding. "I'm tired, man, tired. That run from Seattle was a bitch." "Your usual feet," the facilitator said, pronouncing the last word, feet. Then he hung up. Well, fellow constant readers. The number 19 has appeared very early on in this story, so we get to click that square. Back to the story. Then he hung up. Dixon looked at swordfish he no longer wanted. He looked at the Kate Winslet TV series he would never finish, at least not in Boston. He thought, and not for the first time, of just packing up and renting a car and driving north. First to New Hampshire, then to Maine, then across to the border to Canada, but they would catch him. This he knew, and the rumors of what happened to TEs who ran included electrocution, evisceration, even being boiled alive. Dixon did not believe these rumors, except he sort of did. He began to pack. There wasn't much. Turbulence experts traveled light. And I get to fill in the middle square of Maine after all. I don't even know if this is going to take place in Maine, but all Stephen King needs to do is name drop the state of Maine, and you get to fill in the Kingo card. As far as my first impressions of this, I assumed at first that Dixon was some sort of hitman, but now I really have no idea. He talks about TEs, turbulence experts, and if they run away, bad things happen to them. So this doesn't seem like your run-of-the-mill hitman or secret operative. I'm wondering if the turbulence expert has some sort of ability, and some dark secret government is using them on flights to protect the aircraft, maybe, or maybe to destroy something. So I have no idea right now if Dixon is a good guy or a bad guy. But I do know that he is tired. Let's see what happens. 2. His ticket was waiting for him at the counter. As always, his assignment placed him in coach, just aft of the starboard wing, in the middle seat. How that particular one could always be available was another mystery, like who the facilitator was, where he was calling from, or what sort of organization he worked for. Like the ticket, the seat was just always waiting for him. Dixon placed his bag in the overhead bin and looked at tonight's neighbors and fellow travelers. A businessman with red eyes and gin breath on the aisle. A middle-aged lady who looked like a librarian next to the window. The businessman grunted something unintelligible when Dixon sidled past him with a murmured apology. The guy was reading a paperback charmingly titled, "Don't Let the Boss F with You." The librarian type was looking out the window at the various pieces of equipment that were trundling back and forth, as if they were the most fascinating things she had ever seen. There was knitting in her lap. Looked to Dixon like a sweater. She turned, gave him a smile, and held out her hand. "Hello, I'm Mary Worth, just like the comic strip chick." Dixon didn't know any comic strip named Mary Worth, but he shook her hand. "Craig Dixon, nice to meet you." The businessman grunted and turned a page in his book. "I'm looking forward to this," Mary Worth said. "I haven't had a real vacation in 12 years. I'm sharing the rent of a little place on Siesta Key with a couple of chums." "Chums," the businessman grunted. The grunt seemed to be his default position. "Yes," Mary Worth twinkled. "We have it for 3 weeks. We've never actually met, but they are true chums. We're all widows. We met in a chat room on the internet. It's so wonderful, the internet. There was nothing like it when I was young." "Pedophiles think it's wonderful too," said the businessman, and turned another page. Ms. Worth's smile faltered, then came on strong. "It's very nice to meet you, Mr. Dixon. Are you traveling for business or pleasure?" "Business," he said. The speakers went ding-dong. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Stewart speaking. You'll see that we are pulling away from the gate and beginning our taxi to runway 3, where we're third in line for takeoff. We estimate a 2-hour and 40-minute flight down to SRQ, which should put you in the land of palms and sandy beaches just before 11 o'clock. Skies are clear, and we're anticipating a smooth ride all the way. Now, I'd like you to fasten your seatbelts, put away any tray tables you may have lowered." "Like we had anything to put on them," the businessman grunted. "And secure any personal possessions you may have been using. Thank you for flying Allied tonight. We know you have many choices." "My ass," the businessman grunted. "Never mind your ass, just read your book," Dixon said. The businessman shot him a startled look. Dixon's heart was already beating hard. His stomach was clenched, his throat dry with anticipation. He could tell himself it was going to be all right. It was always all right. But that didn't help. He dreaded the depths that would soon open beneath him. Allied 19 took off at 8:13 p.m., just 3 minutes behind schedule. All right, what are your predictions so far, constant readers? I have a theory about Dixon's job on this aircraft. Given that he is a turbulence expert, so-called, I'm wondering if he has some sort of supernatural power that keeps airplanes from going down in storms. That's really silly now that I've said that out loud, but that's my only idea that I have so far. So I can't wait to see what Stephen King comes up with. Also, I do want to mention on our Kingo card, normally by the time we get several pages into a Stephen King story, there have been many uses of parenthesis, but so far in this text, I haven't seen a single parenthesis being used. So it looks like our favorite author is mixing it up. Here we go, back to the story. Somewhere over Maryland, a flight attendant pushed a drinks and snacks cart down the aisle. The businessman put his book aside, waiting impatiently for her to reach him. When she did, he took a can of Schweppes tonic, 2 little bottles of gin, and a bag of Fritos. His MasterCard didn't work when she ran it, and he gave her his American Express card, glaring at her as if the failure of his first offering were her fault. Dixon wondered if the MasterCard was maxed out, and Mr. Businessman saved the Amex for break glass in case of emergency situations. It could be. His haircut was bad, and he looked frayed around the edges. It didn't matter one way or the other to Dixon, but it was something to think about besides the constant low terror, the anticipation. They were cruising at 34,000 feet, and that was a long way down. Mary Worth asked for some wine and poured it neatly into her little plastic glass. "You're not having anything, Mr. Dixon?" "No, I don't eat or drink on airplanes." Mr. Businessman grunted. He was already through his first gin and tonic and starting on the second. "You're a white-knuckle flyer, aren't you?" Mary Worth asked sympathetically. "Yes." There was no reason not to admit it. "I'm afraid I am." "Needless," Mr. Businessman said. Refreshed by his drink, he was speaking actual words instead of grunting them out. "Safest form of travel ever invented. Hasn't been a commercial aircraft crash in donkey's years. At least not in this country." "I don't mind," Mary Worth said. She had gotten halfway into her small bottle, and there were roses in her cheeks. Her eyes sparkled. "I haven't been on a plane since my husband died 5 years ago. But the two of us used to fly together 3 or 4 times a year. I feel close to God up here." As if on cue, a baby began to cry. "If heaven is this crowded and noisy," Mr. Businessman observed, surveying the 737's crowded coach cabin, "I don't want to go." "They say it's 50 times safer than automobile travel," Mary Worth said. "Perhaps even more. It might have been 100. "Try 500 times safer." Mr. Businessman leaned past Dixon and held out a hand to Mary Worth. Gin had worked its temporary miracle, turning him from surly to affable. "Frank Freeman." She shook with him, smiling. Craig Dixon sat between them, upright and miserable. But when Freeman offered his hand, he shook it. "Wow," Freeman said, and actually laughed. "You are scared. But you know what they say, cold hands, warm heart." He tossed off the rest of his drink. Dixon's own credit cards always worked. He stayed in first-class hotels and ate first-class meals. Sometimes he spent the night with a good-looking woman, paying extra to indulge in quirks that were not, at least judging by certain internet sites Mary Worth probably did not visit, very quirky. He had friends among other turbulence experts. They were a close-knit crew, bound together not only by their occupation, but by their fears. The pay was far better than good. There were all those fringe benefits, but at times like this, none of it seemed to matter. At times like this, there was only the fear. It would be all right. It was always all right. But as he waited for the shitstorm to happen, that thought had no power, which was, of course, what made him good at the job. 34,000 feet. A long way down. 4. CAT for clear air turbulence. Dixon knew it well, but was never prepared for it. Allied 19 was somewhere above South Carolina when it hit this time. A woman was making her way to the toilet at the back of the plane. A young man wearing jeans and a fashionable scruff of beard was bending to talk to a woman in an aisle seat on the port side, the two of them laughing about something. Mary Worth was dozing with her head resting against the window. Frank Freeman was halfway through his 3rd drink and his 2nd bag of Fritos. The jetliner canted to port and took a gigantic upward leap, thudding and creaking. The woman, on her way to the can, was flung across the last row of portside seats. The bearded, scruffy young man flew into the overhead bulkhead, getting one hand up just in time to cushion the blow. Several people who had unfastened their seatbelts rose above their seatbacks as if levitated. There were screams. The plane dropped like a stone down a well, thudded, then rose again, now tilting the other way. Freeman had been caught raising his drink and was now wearing it. "Fuck," he cried. Dixon shut his eyes and waited to die. He knew he would not if he did his job. It was what he was there for, but it was always the same. He always waited to die. The ding-dong went. "This is your captain speaking." Stewart's voice was, as some sportscaster had popularized the phrase, as cool as the other side of the pillow.
"We seem to have run into some unexpected turbulence, folks. I have—"
The plane took another horrifying lift. 60 tons of metal thrown upward like a piece of charred paper in a chimney, then dropped with another of those creaking thuds. There were more screams. The bathroom-bound lady, who had picked herself up, staggered backward, flailed her arms, and fell into the seats on the starboard side. Mr. Beardscruff was couched in the aisle, holding on to the armrests on either side. 2 or 3 of the overhead compartments popped open, and luggage tumbled out.
"Fuck,"
Freeman said again.
"So I've turned on the seatbelt sign," the pilot resumed. "Sorry about this, folks. We'll be back to smooth air."
The plane began to rise and fall in a series of stuttering jerks, like a stone skipping across a pond.
"In just a few, so hang in there."
The plane dropped, then booted upward again. The carry-on bags in the aisle rose and fell and tumbled. Craig Dixon's eyes were crammed shut. His heart was now running so fast that there seemed to be no individual beats. His mouth was sour with adrenaline. He felt a hand creep into his and opened his eyes. Mary Worth was staring at him, her face parchment pale, her eyes huge. "Are we going to die, Mr. Dixon?" "Yes," he thought. "This time we are going to die." "No," he said. "We're perfectly all The plane seemed to run into a brick wall, throwing them forward against their belts, and then heeled over to port. 30 degrees, 40, 50. Just when Dixon was sure it was going to roll over completely, it righted itself. Dixon heard people yelling. The baby was wailing. A man was shouting. "It's okay, Julie. It's normal. It's okay." Dixon shut his eyes again and let the terror fully take him. It was horrible. It was the only way. He saw them rolling back, this time not stopping, but all the way over. He saw the big jet losing its place in the thermodynamic mystery that had formerly held it up. He saw the nose rising fast, then slowing, then heeling downward like a roller coaster car about to plunge. He saw the plane starting its ultimate dive, the passengers who had been unbelted now plastered to the ceiling, the yellow oxygen masks doing a final frantic tarantella in the air. He saw the baby flying forward and disappearing into business class, still waiting. He saw the plane hit, the nose in the first-class compartment, nothing but a crumpled steel bouquet blooming its way into coach, sprouting wires and plastic and severed limbs, even as the fire exploded, and Dixon drew a final breath that ignited his lungs like paper bags. What a wonderfully crafted paragraph that was. I love it when Stephen King gets into a flow with his imagery. And even though I believe Dixon is just visualizing that this is what happens to the plane, we do get a giant explosion, so we can click that one, and then there is a giant explosion. All of this in mere seconds, perhaps 30, no more than 40, and so real it might actually have been happening. Then, after taking one more antic bounce, the plane steadied, and Dixon opened his eyes. Mary Worth was staring at him, her eyes welling with tears. "I thought we were going to die," she said. "I knew we were going to die. I saw it." So did I, Dixon thought.
"Nonsense."
Although he sounded hearty, Freeman looked decidedly green around the gills.
"These planes are, the way they're built, they could fly into a hurricane,
A liquid belch halted his disquisition. Freeman plucked an airsick bag from the pocket in the back of the seat ahead of him, opened it, and put it over his mouth. There followed a noise that reminded Dixon of a small but efficient coffee grinder. It stopped, then started again. All right, everybody, we've got some vomit, so fill in that square. The ding-dong went.
Sorry about that, folks,
Captain Stewart said, still sounding as cool as the other side of the pillow.
It happens from time to time, a little weather phenomenon we call clear air turbulence. The good news is I've called it in, and other aircraft will be vectored around that particular trouble spot. The better news is that we'll be landing in 40 minutes, and I guarantee you a smooth ride the rest of the way.
Merryworth laughed shakily. That's what he said before. Frank Freeman was folding down the top of his airsick bag, doing it like a man with experience.
It wasn't fear, don't get that idea, just plain old motion sickness. Can't even ride in the back seat of a car without getting nauseated.
I'm going to take a train back to Boston, Merryworth said. No more of that, thank you very much. Dixon watched as the flight attendants first made sure that the unbelted passengers were all right, then cleared the aisle of spilled luggage. The cabin was filled with chatter and nervous laughter. Dixon watched and listened, his heartbeat returning to normal. He was tired. He was always tired after saving an aircraft filled with passengers. The rest of the flight was routine, just as the captain had promised. That is the end of that chapter, but the story goes on. As I mentioned, my prediction was that he was going to save the aircraft, but also in my mind, I thought that once he is revealed as the savior, that would pretty much be the end of the story. But that's not the case. Let's see what happens. 5. Merryworth hurried after her luggage, which would be arriving on Carousel 2 downstairs. Dixon, with just one small bag, stopped for a drink in Dewar's clubhouse. He invited Mr. Businessman to join him, but Freeman shook his head. I puked up tomorrow's hangover somewhere over the South Carolina-Georgia line, and I think I'll quit while I'm ahead. Good luck with your business in Sarasota, Mr. Dixon. Dixon, whose business had actually been transacted over that same South Carolina-Georgia line, nodded and thanked him. A text came in while he was finishing his whiskey and soda. It was from the facilitator. Just 2 words. Good job. He took the escalator down. A man in a dark suit and a chauffeur's cap was standing at the bottom, holding a sign with his name on it. That's me, Dixon said. Where am I booked? The Ritz-Carlton, the driver said. Very nice. Of course it was, and there would be a fine suite waiting for him, probably with a bay view. There would also be a rental car waiting for him in the hotel garage, should he care to visit a nearby beach or any of the local attractions. In the room, he would find an envelope containing a list of various female services, which he had no interest in taking advantage of tonight. All he wanted tonight was sleep. When he and the driver stepped out onto the curb, he saw Merryworth standing by herself, looking a bit forlorn. She had a suitcase on either side of her, matching, of course, and tartan. Her phone was in her hand. Ooh, we got parenthesis here. Matching, of course, and tartan. So we get to fill in that square. I knew Stephen King wouldn't be able to resist using parenthesis. Ms. Worth, Dixon said. She looked up and smiled. Hello, Mr. Dixon. We survived, didn't we? We did. Is someone meeting you? One of your chums? Mrs. Yeager. Claudette was supposed to, but her car won't start. I was just about to call an Uber. He thought of what she'd said when the turbulence, 40 seconds that had seemed like 4 hours, finally eased. I knew we were going to die. I saw it. You don't need to do that. We can take you to Siesta Key. He pointed to the stretch limo a little way down the curb, then turned to the driver. Can't we? Of course, sir. She looked at him doubtfully. Are you sure? It's awfully late. My pleasure, he said. Let's do this thing. 6. Ooh, this is nice, Merryworth said, settling into the leather seat and stretching out her legs. Whatever your business is, you must be very successful at it, Mr. Dixon. Call me Craig. You're Mary, I'm Craig. We should be on first-name basis, because I want to talk to you. He pressed a button, and the privacy glass went up. Mary Worth watched this rather nervously, then turned to Dixon. You aren't going to, as they say, put a move on me, are you? He smiled. No, you're safe with me. You said you were going to take the train back. Did you mean that? Absolutely. Do you remember me saying that flying made me feel close to God? Yes. I didn't feel close to God while we were being tossed like a salad 6 or 7 miles up in the air. Not at all. I only felt close to death. Would you ever fly again? She considered the question carefully, watching the palms and car dealerships and fast food franchises slide past as they rolled south on the to Miami Trail. I suppose I would, if someone was on his deathbed, say, and I had to get there fast. Only I don't know who that someone would be, because I don't have much in the way of family. My late husband and I never had children. My parents are dead, and that just leaves a few cousins that I rarely email with, let alone see. Better and better, Dixon thought. But you'd be afraid. Yes. She looked back at him, eyes wide. I really thought we were going to die. In the sky, if the plane came apart, or on the ground if it didn't. Nothing left of us but charred little bits. Let me spin you a hypothetical, Dixon said. Don't laugh. Think about it seriously. Okay. Suppose there's an organization whose job is to keep airplanes safe. There is, Mary Worth said, smiling. I believe it's called the FAA. Never mind them. Suppose it was an organization that could predict which airplanes would encounter severe and unexpected turbulence on any given flight. Mary Worth clapped her hands in soft applause, smiling more widely now, into it. No doubt staffed by precognates. Those are people who see the future, Dixon said. And wasn't that possible? Likely even? How else could the facilitator get his information? But let's say their ability to see the future is limited to this one thing. Well, why would that be? Why wouldn't they be able to predict elections, football scores, the Kentucky Derby? I don't know, Dixon said, thinking maybe they can. Maybe they can predict all sorts of things. These facilitator precognates in some hypothetical room. Maybe they do. He didn't care. Now, let's go a little further. Let's suppose Mr. Freeman was wrong. The turbulence of the sort we encountered tonight is a lot more serious than anyone, including airlines, believes or is willing to admit. Suppose that kind of turbulence can only be survived if there is at least one talented, terrified passenger on each plane that encounters it. He paused. And suppose that on tonight's flight, that talented and terrified passenger was me. She peeled merry laughter, and only sobered when she saw he wasn't joining her. What about the planes that fly into hurricanes, Craig? I believe Mr. Freeman mentioned something about planes like that just before he needed to use the airsick bag. Those planes survive turbulence that's probably even worse than what we experienced this evening. But the people flying them know what they're getting into, Dixon said. They are mentally prepared. The same is true of many commercial flights. The pilot will come on even before takeoff and say, "Folks, I'm sorry, but we're in for a bit of a rough ride tonight, so keep those seatbelts buckled." I get it, she said. Mentally prepared passengers could use, I guess you'd call it, united telepathic strength to hold the plane up. It's only unexpected turbulence that would call for the presence of someone already prepared, a terrified, I don't know what you'd call a person like that. A turbulence expert, Dixon said quietly. That's what you'd call them, what you'd call me. You're not serious. I am. And I'm sure you're thinking right now that you're riding with a man suffering a serious delusion, and you can't wait to get out of this car. But in fact, it is my job. I'm well paid. By whom? I don't know. A man calls. I and other turbulence experts, there are a few dozen of us, call him the facilitator. Sometimes weeks go by between calls. Once it was 2 months. This time was only 2 days. I came to Boston from Seattle and over the Rockies. He wiped a hand over his mouth, not wanting to remember, but remembering anyway. Let's just say it was bad. There were a couple of broken arms. They turned. Dixon looked out the window and saw a sign reading Siesta Key, 2 miles. If that was true, she said, why in God's name would you do it? The pay is good. The amenities are good. I like to travel, or did anyway. After 5 or 10 years, all places start to look the same. But mostly, he leaned forward and took one of her hands in both of his. He thought she might pull away, but she didn't. She was looking at him, fascinated. It's saving lives. There were over 150 people on that airplane tonight. Only the airlines don't just call them people, they call them souls. And that's the right way to put it. I saved 150 souls tonight. And since I've been doing this job, I've saved thousands. He shook his head. No, tens of thousands. But you're terrified each time. I saw you tonight, Craig. You were in mortal terror. So was I. Unlike Mr. Freeman, who only threw up because he was airsick. Mr. Freeman could never do this job, Dixon said. You can't do the job unless you're convinced each time the turbulence starts that you are going to die. You're convinced of that even though you know you're the one making sure that won't happen. The driver spoke quietly from the intercom. 5 minutes, Mr. Dixon. I must say this has been a fascinating discussion, Mary Worth said. May I ask how you got this unique job in the first place? By the way, for the record, I think I love Miss Mary Worth. I like how she is pretty accepting of Dixon's rather outrageous claims. I was recruited, Dixon said, as I am recruiting you right now. She smiled, but this time she didn't laugh. All right, I'll play. Suppose you did recruit me. What would you get out of it? A bonus? Yes, Dixon said. 2 years of his future service forgiven. That was the bonus. 2 years closer to retirement. He had told the truth about having altruistic motives, saving lives, saving souls. But he had also told the truth about how travel eventually became wearying. The same was true of saving souls, when the price of doing so was endless moments of terror high above the earth. Should he tell her that once you were in, you couldn't get out? That it was your basic deal with the devil? He should, but he wouldn't. They swung into the circular drive of a beachfront condo. 2 ladies, undoubtedly Mary Worth's chums, were waiting there. Would you give me your phone number? Dixon asked. What, so you can call me? Or so you can pass it on to your boss, your facilitator? The latter, Dixon said. She paused, thinking. The chums in waiting were almost dancing with excitement. Then Mary opened her purse and took out a card. She handed it to Dixon. This is my cell number. You can also reach me at the Boston Public Library. Dixon laughed. I knew you were a librarian. Everyone does, she said. It's a bit boring, but it pays the rent, as they say. She opened the door. The chums squealed like rock show groupies when they saw her. There are more exciting occupations, Dixon said. She looked at him gravely. There's a big difference between temporary excitement and mortal fear, Craig, as I think we both know. He couldn't argue with her on that score, but it wasn't exactly a no. He got out and helped the driver with her bags while Mary Worth hugged two of the widows she had met in an internet chat room. 7. Mary was back in Boston and had almost forgotten Craig Dixon when her phone rang one night. Her caller was a man with a very slight lisp. They talked for quite a while. The following day, Mary Worth was on Jetaway Flight 694, non-stop from Boston to Dallas, sitting in coach, just aft of the starboard wing, middle seat. She refused anything to eat or drink. The turbulence struck over Oklahoma. And that is the end. All right, okay, we got a secret society. And what's interesting about this particular secret society in terms of a Stephen King story is that it's pretty benevolent. The facilitator is ominous, and it's kind of creepy that once you do this job, you apparently can't get out of it. But it seems like there is an end date in store for Dixon because he gets a 2-year bonus off of future service, 2 years closer to retirement. This was an intriguing story. I hope you liked listening to it. On some of the Kingo cards, you might see a square that says a corrupt government official. And if you have that one, you could check it. I don't think I have it on this particular Kingo card of mine. But let's check this Kingo card, because I think there's at least a couple more things we can fill out. All right, we got the first 2 squares. The third square here is characters hear another voice in his or her mind. And technically that happened a little bit because he was remembering something that Mary Worth had said. But for me, the intention of this square is different than just a memory. Stephen King will have his characters basically have imaginary conversations with different people that they remember. So it could be a long-lost brother or a parent or, a best friend. So I'm not going to click that one. A kid did not die. I didn't get any ghosts or spirits. There was no childhood bully. Surprisingly, I don't think the narrator ever told us that a character made a decision that she will regret. I don't think we got any accents spelled out how they sound. There wasn't a religious zealot. We didn't get a character going insane. This one, characters with the initials RF. I did not notice that. We had Mr. Freeman, but that was Frank Freeman. A missed opportunity there, Mr. King. Did someone sing a song or recite a poem? I don't think so. Someone laughs uproariously at something unfunny. I didn't catch that one there. I don't think there were any mentions of breasts, or the Red Sox, or aliens, or a mentally challenged savant. We didn't even get King's usual attire, chambray shirt, or Lord Buxton wallet, or the Sam Brown belt, or engineer boots. And I didn't even catch a reference to another Stephen King book. There was a little bit of alcohol involved with Frank Freeman, so I'm going to click that one because Frank is probably an alcoholic. And it seems like there are ESP powers at work, sort of behind the scenes in this story. So that means I filled in 8 spaces, but I never got 5 across. So I did not get a Stephen Kingo. But maybe if you were playing along, maybe you did. So let us know in the comments how you fared. And also, if there's something that I didn't catch that you think I should have counted, let us know in the comments as well. And let us know what you think of Stephen King's relatively new story, The Turbulence Expert. And as always, thank you for watching and listening to the Stephen King Book Club.